You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
You're listening to the Show Jumping Podcast, a fun and informative show for riders, owners, trainers, grooms, and fans of all levels.
I'm Kristy McCormick in Saratoga Springs, New York.
And I'm Kimmy Carlson in St. Louis, Missouri.
And you're listening to the Show Jumping Podcast, where we deliver at-home riding exercises to our listeners and chat with fellow horse enthusiasts about the world of show jumping. Before our guest, a quick word from our title sponsor.
Relyne GI is a natural, long-term alternative that goes beyond masking symptoms. This unique blend of gut-friendly hyaluronan and wellness-boosting beta-glucan works with your horse's body to soothe and protect their digestive system. Unlike traditional therapies that can disrupt digestion and nutrient absorption, Relyne GI leaves your horse's natural balance intact. But don't take our word for it. Relyne GI is field tested by leading veterinarians and backed by peer-reviewed research, including a study by Dr. Nathan Slovis, showing it effectively reduces gastric ulcers in active horses. Plus, it's Clean Sport certified and safe for competition use. Head over to resolvet.com. That's RESOLVET.com and use code SJP at checkout for 10% off, linked in our show notes.
Welcome, everybody. Today, Kimmy and I are taking the reins over just by ourselves, and we thought we'd do a nice long training podcast where the two of us talk about our favorite lessons, both mine to teach and Kimmy's to have, and Kimmy, probably yours to teach a little bit too. I think you taught a few of your college riding buddies, didn't you, at some point?
I did.
Hopefully you just repeated all the lessons you learned from me.
That is also correct.
So let's give our listeners a little quick recap. You are 6 years my junior. I was your first trainer and you were my first student when I was 18. And actually, I don't know if you were, I was your very first trainer. I'm sure our mother was really your first trainer since she would have been teaching you when I was still a junior. But in a serious riding sense, that's where we began our riding relationship. And I remember at the time being so invested and serious about your technical and specific riding skills at age 12. Which now looking back, I should have just been happy that, you were staying on and finding any jumps at all and doing the correct course, really. So can you take us back a little bit, and maybe not to age 12, but maybe into your equitation days of age 14, 15, 16? And do you have let's do this. Do you have any favorite lessons that I've given you? And then maybe later tell me some not so favorites that we should have skipped over.
No, I think I have sort of a favorite / through the, lens of history. Mostly what sticks out is memorable lessons, some of which certainly fall into the infamous bucket. So we'll table those for now. But I think to your point, I mean, as I was writing down this list, right, most of these are lessons that were with you or sometimes mom at a young age. And I think there's, that does speak to just the level of investment that I got from you specifically for so many years. And these kinds of lessons that were just so one-on-one and so, took so much time and energy.
Yeah.
They did make, I think that's, I credit, the rider I become and what I was able to do as a 17, 18-year-old to a lot of the time that was put in to me, whether I necessarily appreciated it or not as a 12-year-old. So some of them, I think, one was, I remember us doing a lot of lunge line lessons where
that's on my list of favorites to teach for sure.
Stand out in the middde of the field with, our 7-year-old equitation horse or 5-year-old, pony that we'd
whatever we could get our hands on at the time.
And
let's set the scene a little bit for our listeners too. So we would, I think for the majority of your years, we were at a barn that was about half an hour away when we lived in New Jersey, right? And so I remember, and at this time now, so I'm 18, I'm doing college on the side at home, which was a strange and terrible idea. For anybody listening who is sending their kid to school and they're contemplating being a riding professional or going to school, go to school. Just do that. And then you can always be a riding professional after that. But I chose to do both at the same time. So I remember mom and I would go out to the barn early in the morning. I was still living at home. I would ride a few, we would get the barn done. I would leave and go to school for my classes that were specifically set during, mid-morning to mid-afternoon, which was another 45 minutes away. Come back and meet you and mom at the barn after you had gotten out of school. Now you were in 7th grade at the time. Yeah. And then I would teach and you would ride until past dinner time, and then we would go home. Exactly. Until it got dark, till we ran out of sunlight. Exactly. So late afternoon, we would be doing these lessons, and we would just try to get you. We were lucky enough to have, a few sales horses, I think, a couple borrowed horses. We could never afford to have our own real string of horses, or even, I think we had one. We were very, very fortunate to have one, kind of focus horse at a time for you. And we had a bunch of, begged and borrowed, hopefully not stolen horses that we were involved with.
To my knowledge, no.
None of those. No illegally acquired. But anyway, so we're out. Yeah. So these lunge line lessons were so valuable. So go ahead, explain then how we would start those.
Yeah, so you have the horse, like you would lunge it under tack, but then, I'm sitting on there, and you start out with just on the flat with all your aids, with your reins, with your stirrups on. And then to the best of my memories is you just start slowly taking things away to where we ended up. You get from there, we're trotting in a circle with all your aids, and then you drop your reins. That's kind of the obvious ones. And
again, for people who want to try this at home, if you haven't yet, if you tie the best, we did this several different ways, but I remember the best way to do this is to have the reins as if you're holding them, tie the bit or the loop of the rein in a knot so it's short, and then if you can tie. I remember trying to tie the mane into
the knot.
Into that knot.
Yeah.
But what's something that's brilliant now is for anybody that rides with a vest, there's a strap that goes, or a loop that goes from the saddle to the vest that you can actually hook the reins right through. So that's the safest way, because you don't want the reins when they're dropped to be hanging down, or the horse might trip on them, or they might slip down to the horse's neck because the rider, once they don't have them, obviously, you have no control of those reins, and your hands would then do what? Kimmy?
So then we would do lots of different things where, with stirrups to start is I would go in like 2-point position, and you would have me put my hands out to the side and then like reach down and touch one toe at a time. Again, first at the walk, then at the trot, then at the canter. And so we're cantering around and having to, reach down, touch toes, kind of I remember we would try to touch their ears with each hand, again, staying balanced and out of the saddle. And then at some point, probably not the first time we did this, but after this was a thing, I would do that with my eyes closed. And so
yes. So you're working on balance and core at the same time.
Yeah. And so it's very, again, just having to kind of listen to the horse, feel where they were, feel where your own body was while moving. And
you're mostly, if I recall, we would do this, and you might have just said this, out of your, in your 2-point where your hands would go, and sitting, right?
And sitting, 2-point sitting. We would do it with, with stirrups. And then again, later on, without certain exercises without stirrups, eyes closed, eyes open, and kind of, so there's all these variations depending on what level you're at, what comfort, how good your horse is at this, right? How comfortable they are.
Because
really work up to where it's you're really having to focus inward on yourself and what's going on. If you have, a good horse and somebody kind of controlling where they're going. We'd also incorporate jumps in there. I don't know. That went sideways a couple of times, if I recall.
Well, I think we learned the best case scenario for that is a cavaletti. That's safest, right? Yeah. Where you at least can place a cavaletti within the horse's path in the circle. I believe initially, and I have free lunge horses this way, is where you set where you set a chute, along a rail, or even a small jump with a pole that's on a diagonal from this top of the standard. This sounds pretty dangerous now that I'm talking about it. Top of the standard down resting on the ground so that your lunge line would just slip up over the pole. You needed a very safe force for this. Over the pole as it went over the jump, and the jump was low and then continued on the circle. But I do remember several, run out several times of potentially you falling off with this. So I would recommend for our listeners that cavaletti is probably the safest, easiest way to incorporate any jumping if you're going to be doing this. And again, on somebody that's very safe, a horse that's very, comfortable with that and safe. And I love that all of that really worked on how much it worked your core as a core workout, core strength you had. I remember getting lunge line lessons from our own mom when I was young, and she would make me, in my 2-point, reach down and touch my toes. Mm-hmm. That's extremely difficult. I think even I did. Did I make you do that? Yes. Okay. Well, you're working on your heels, weighting your heels at that point. Yeah.
No, it was hard.
That is with stirrups, and without. Then the hardest one is to do that without stirrups. That's very, very challenging. But our lunge line lessons were so helpful though, because then, as I recall, once you got all of your aids back, you felt like you were, it was just free riding. Like everything was just so much easier then after that. Did you feel that way?
No, I agree. They were very helpful. And I think especially the flat work stuff, especially where the jumping is kind of fun and interesting. But I think really with the benefits of that balance and that focus and the learning where your balance points are and how to sit with the horse without, your aids, whether it's visual or the reins or your stirrups, and getting that just like a level of comfort up there that then once you get back, you're like, oh, great. I can, I have so much more freedom to kind of focus on one or the other.
And look how effective my aids actually are now that I have them. Sometimes we lose sight of how they're used, or the fact I guess I should say we take for granted the fact that you have reins all the time, and of course they're there, and when you take them away, you might understand how much you rely on your balance on those reins on hands. I've had a lot of riders that once I take their reins away, they realize they have a hard time even posting, and that's a pretty normal challenge to go through, is how to balance on your horse without balancing on their mouth. And I think that's another big benefit that you learn when you're in a lunge line lesson.
Yeah, I agree. I think another one I have on my list is also, I think also mostly we did it on flat work. And it is kind of an iteration of this where I wasn't on a lunge line, but it would often be where I was really kind of coming up against a wall with a certain horse, with myself, just a certain skill, whether it was like, learning how to do a proper, half pass or a lead change or some sort of thing that I was struggling with. And I remember many lessons where you would just be almost monologuing me through this, like kind of over and over, and giving me really way more information than I could ever absorb at once. But the sort of this practice of, it was always, very calmly, which kind of helped with the just like, yes, this is part of the process. This is fine. Nothing's going wrong. And then I remember, as you were often saying, you're repeating yourself a lot, but each time you sort of absorb more and more of what you're saying as you kind of get that piece and something clicks, and then you can kind of listen to sort of the next thing. And again, I just think back to the amount of information that I was given over time.
Yeah.
That sort of density of just, again, it's one-on-one. These are kind of time intensive, but I do, now 20 years later, look back and just sort of remember that feeling of that light bulb going on, and that sort of you kind of holding my hand with just that constant communication of what was happening, what I was expecting, what was, what to try to change, do a little bit differently, was so helpful. And, and again, at the time, I'm sure, I was frustrated. I was in, not being able to do something. But in hindsight, it really did. Those were some of my kind of breakthrough moments, especially on the flat, especially when you get into like the real nuance of what getting a horse to do something very specific that it might not know how to do or doesn't want to do, and learning that skill yourself at the same time takes a lot of help.
Do you remember anything specifically or one thing specifically that you can describe in one of those flat work lessons? Because I do get a lot of questions from my old students about things like how to get your horse round on the flat. And I'm not trying to feed you the answers at all, but like how to, what are the step-by-step instructions for a lead change or a half pass, or something that maybe you particularly struggled with that we had to work on over time?
Yeah, I think something I struggled with, and always have, has been I really had a hard time getting horses in front of my leg. I was a rider that was much more prone to just kind of let horses be, rode a lot on balance. So horses that had their own motor, that was great. But if they didn't, like for truly most horses, and even ones that do, to really create the connection in front of your legs into the bit, into the bridle, I struggled with so much. I just wanted to let them be. And so figuring out for each horse how to do that. And then really for me, that was the root of most of the other problems I was having, whether it was issues with a lead change or issues with a, good, whether it's a lateral movement or anything else, often stemmed from just that, having a hard time creating that forward momentum and connection in the first place.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of what riders struggle with now, whether you're doing, the 2-6 adult hunters or the 3-6, middle Macaulay equitation, is starting with that basic of, is your horse in front of your leg? And I start a lot of, in these clinics these days, I have to be I do look back on these lessons that I taught you, because the first, when you're doing a lesson, sometimes we rush through the flat work and sometimes we sort of say, okay, are you ready to jump? And that's, has its purpose in some instances and not always. But in a clinic, you have more time and you can take the time to start at the walk. And, I always start with, okay, everybody, your only focus as if your horse is walking forward and straight. And let's talk about what aids you can use to do that. Both legs, making sure that your horse's right hind is following its right front and its left hind is following its left front. And then both reins, keeping that front end on track, steering, making sure they're not, going sideways with their neck or their head. And, and it's amazing how just the walk can do so much of the work and the homework for you in getting your horse in front of your leg. Because if you can do that, and I'm not sure how much we worked on that with you and I, because I know that we did a lot of sitting, trot, and canter work together. Is that what you recall?
It is. And I'm glad you brought up the walk, because it's something I did learn later when I was riding really young horses, and something I figured out on my own like, just like you said, it's starting there. You can get so much done at the walk.
Right. And I think, for anybody who struggles with getting their horse round, we always want to sort of pull their heads down or say, why is the mouth not working so well? But being in front of your leg is the mouth. That truly is. And it's hard to conceptualize until you're up there and you can feel when the power that you're creating, again, not fast. This is impulsion, right? Your power you're creating from the hind end makes the front end lighter, which makes the mouth lighter because the pole goes up and then the nose can drop. And it's really about the biomechanics of the horse. I didn't learn that as much either right when you were that age, or by the time you were, coming into your own as a junior. That took a while, and a lot of other trainers incorporated lessons that I learned from them to understand that feeling. I think that takes a little more experience. All right. Yeah. Give me a lesson where maybe it was helpful for riding, but you really, really wasn't on your list of favorites.
I think you know what I'm going to say.
I don't know. I think I have a few ideas, but I'm a little afraid of which pick.
Lake Placid.
Okay.
I believe fairly infamous short stirrup ring, no stirrups, flat lessons.
That ring, I would love teaching in that ring. So for anybody unfamiliar with Lake Placid, they've got all of these, it's hard to find places to lesson up there. They've got one shared schooling area in the back that is, you can say it's scheduled, but it's challenging to even get into a time frame when you're not fighting 20 other riders that are in there. And so I do remember, I think maybe even on like the first Monday we got there, Missy, we would be with North Run at that time. I was working for them and you were riding with them, and she would say, okay, we'll go give a flat lesson, and that was the only instruction. She was very good about letting me do whatever I thought during the lesson was necessary, which probably to your dismay was not part of your favorite part of the day. And then we would go up to this very, very small ring in the corner that was only used for showing on Sunday of each week for the short stirrup section because it was so small. And that was where you could still flat. And if we were lucky, we didn't run into 20 other people, but no jumping was allowed up there. And so go ahead, Kimmy, what kind of lesson did I give?
Also it was very hot. It's hot as dust. I don't think they watered that ring at all.
July, yes.
And there were at least the one, this was a couple years. It became a bit of a routine, but I think there were probably 10 of us in there. And this was a lot of people. And I think
10 students in this lesson, you mean?
Yes, it's 10 students.
Yeah.
And I remember two things. I remember it going on forever and being like, I'm so thirsty. I'm so hot.
And I was not into breaks at that point. I wasn't going to let anybody stop.
But I also remember the feeling of, at the end of the lesson, just how soft and connected and just like good. And I was probably on Tom, my equitation horse, Tommy, and just how good we felt and like how easy everything was and connected. And so it was that of like, I'm so hot and tired and thirsty, but also this is a really, really cool feeling that I don't get most of the time when you're just sort of out, riding, exercising, right?
Yeah.
And really to dig deep. And I'm sure he was tired too, but very it is a really cool feeling. And it does kind of give you that glimpse of like, oh, okay, this is what I can create. It takes a lot of work and it's not necessarily something I'm going to do every day, but it is there. And I think that's cool to kind of you can have to be forced into feeling that.
And I think I remember up there, because we couldn't jump, but we did have poles. I would set that 3 pole in a row exercise where it's on, and this is great to do at home. Again, for our listeners who can set, and I think I've described this a little bit on this podcast, but in detail in that specific ring, I remember, let's say that ring is, I don't know, 70 by maybe. I was going to say 70 by 100, something like that, but it's small in riding terms. And I would on let's say semicircle where you would put 3 poles out, not exactly in a tight turn, but in sort of a 2 bending line session. And I would make everybody use their track. And I have done this exercise on the podcast with jumps that I've talked about, but I liked how with poles on the ground, poles are really underappreciated sometimes because it's not just for finding distances, but it is for finding a measure of space that you have between 2 obstacles and using your track or your speed to change it. And I remember repeating several times with your group, okay, you're going to do 6 to 7, you're going to do it this way, or you're going to do it in a straight line and you're going to really change your pace, come in really strong for a 5 and then slow way down after jump, pole 2 and fit 8 in or something crazy. I'm sure I asked for something that was a lot harder than it should have been at the time. Something insane. Yeah. My level of insanity and intensity has definitely decreased since the age of, 20-year-old trainer Kristy. Now, 20 years later, I'm happy that anybody can, follow a basic instruction and have a good time doing it. That's kind of my, perspective at this point. But I did really enjoy, and again, you were a group of 16, 17-year-olds trying to get ready for the equitation for that one of the hardest weeks of the year in Lake Placid. And we nailed it. Those lessons were long too. They were probably hour-long flat lessons.
At least. Yeah. Like hour plus of just flatting. And I think that those are burned into several 30-somethings memories at this point.
Yes,
scattered across the world. If you dared to ask.
Some happily remembered and some not, but
Yeah.
I think it benefited, everybody at the time in some purpose. Everybody stuck with it. That was the thing. And that's the thing about any lesson, and that's kind of the thing about life. If you can the stress or the pressure that you feel, if you can find some sense of ease while you're in that moment, you can get through it. I mean, these things do pass. And then the best thing is that pressure always creates some learning environment. You gain something out of it. You might not have nailed the lesson, but that will stick in your brain and in your horse's body to carry over for the next day or the next, week or next class. I've I enjoyed giving longline lessons and those flat lessons. Can you think of a jumping lesson that you really enjoyed that also our listeners could maybe try to set at home?
This is in a specific course. So I do have one on here. And again, this was kind of for me and I think mom would do this, you would do this as well, where you would actually call out the next jump. I think as I was landing or as I was in the air, maybe, or taking out right as I was kind of jumping the previous jump. And so we'd have kind of this, it requires kind of a lot of jumps, kind of in a course, but some kind of sort of scattered around, and probably a lot of kind of thought on your part. So it is sort of takes a lot of work on the part of the trainer, but and we would do kind of long courses. We'd probably jump like 15 to 20 jumps in a row if it was going up.
Yeah.
You would just call out.
Stop.
Yeah. Call out the next jump. And sometimes that jump was, 4-stride bending line out from where I was. And sometimes it was, a whole, field away. And that, I think, was so valuable, again, just to really be able to kind of think on the fly, and not you don't have a plan. And so to have to just, take things, be listening. So it's splitting your attention of I'm paying attention to what my horse is doing, but I also have to be listening to you. And I think that skill, that sort of task loading is one term people use. Skill of being able to kind of have your attention here and also here, and not sort of spin both of those plates at the same time, and then have enough control and be, so where I can successfully accomplish whatever you tell me to do next, and kind of have a horse in a place where, I can put them wherever. Those were hard, and they were really fun and really just kind of mentally challenging. And I think especially going into really for anything, but the jumpers or anything where you're just having to kind of think a little bit on the fly and have a loose plan, but a plan that you can change as you go. Very helpful.
You can enjoy your favorite equine videos all in one place with Ride TV, the ultimate equine streaming platform. The newly relaunched Ride TV has all the series you love, like Rockstar Vets and Mini Horses, plus top-tier training videos and event footage from barrelracing.com and Horse and Rider on Demand. Whether you're ready to relax with your favorite series, binge watch competition footage, or train with a world champion, subscribe to Ride TV today for only $19.99 to see where your ride takes you. Visit ridetvgo.tv to subscribe.
That's so interesting that you say that was one of your favorites, because I did ask a group of my I had this awesome group of amateur riders at one time, and we rode in a field. It seems like everywhere, every barn I've ever been at, I've been lucky enough to always have a field of jumps, which I think is so valuable to have alone. Like, forget the calling out jumps, but the having to ride on grass in an open field with no boundaries. And both as a trainer, you have to be pretty creative as to how to set the course, because it's very easy to see a ring and go side diagonal, or just a nice, a typical equitation course that you might have. But when you're in a field, it's sort of free range and you can be really creative, but you have to be really thoughtful about where things go. And so many of them answered that riding in a field was one of their highlights of lessons. But I did get the exact same answer you said about a lesson where you call out the jumps. And you're right. It could be right in front of you. It could be 25 strides away, but the advantage of that forces you to stay in the moment too. You do have to think quickly right ahead, but you can't get rushed into where you think the course is taking you, because you don't know. And I do love doing that too. And as a trainer, it's fun to do because you can ad lib as you go. You can tell, as the student is riding, if you think they need to go do something a little harder, then you can. It's not just do these 8 jumps and then walk, and that's so great. I love that. I think that's really fun to both watch and I think to ride too.
Yeah, no, they were very useful. I don't remember us doing a ton of them, probably I think they're certainly their own thing, but it's to practice again that kind of task loading and being able to think quickly is super, super important.
And I think too, again, for listeners, if you have your horse at home and you don't need a trainer to do that, you can have a friend just call out, okay, this jump. If you're one of those, if you get to school on your own more than if you're in a lesson. And I think that's kind of interesting too, because if you have somebody who's not trying to get you to do anything very hard, then it's a real, open-ended question as to where you're going next. What about anything very specific in terms of, like, go back to thinking about riding in an indoor during the winter, and we had a smaller space now. So now we're not outside in the big field and have all these jumps. But, one of my favorites of trying to teach you how to land a lead, which is necessary in the equitation. We don't think about it a lot in the hunters, but certainly, if you're ever doing any derbies, that's a big thing. Certainly in the jumpers, you're not trying to influence in the air which direction they're going, but obviously in a jump off, you're thinking about landing and turning right away. So if you have your horse on the correct lead as they land, that's necessary. Do you remember specifically that lesson that I gave?
The lesson landing the lead?
Yeah.
I remember some, maybe not that specific lesson. I do remember you when I was, I believe, 13, building the box in the indoor.
Oh, yes. Describe that. And that would have been a landing lead lesson too.
It would have been one of them. Yeah. So the box, as I remember it, was actually something that came up in one of your finals, medal finals,
Yep.
I believe.
Yep. When I was a junior. Yeah. I had to. So the way it was set up at Harrisburg that year, and that year I rode a very flexible, wonderful equitation horse. It came out of Holly Hill Farm, actually, out of Boston. And you had I'm gonna say what they said at medal finals, and then you tell me what we said at home. So I'm not totally sure what we said at home. At the medal finals, they said it was basically an L. It was a box, but one side of it there were two split rail verticals, 2 next to each other. So if you can imagine 2 verticals next to each other, sharing a center standard. And then 90 degrees from them were exactly the same setting. So you had 4 verticals that were all connected. And then on the other 2 sides of the box were bushes, or, any sort of boundary that you just couldn't pass. So once you were in, you had to jump out. I think the bushes were there for the horses that maybe would say no thank you to jumping out once they got in, because it was hard. You either had to jump the outside box of verticals, which were a bending 90-degree 2 strides. You could jump, I have to remember this correctly. You could do outside to inside if you really set up the angle, and it would have come up as 1 stride. Or you could do a bounce from the corner to the corner, which was also, and it wasn't 3/6. It was probably really set at 3 feet, no smaller though. Maybe the outsides were 3/6 and the 2 centers were 3 feet. Anyways, it was very challenging. We saw several different attempts that year that were unsuccessful. I know that at least one person attempted the bounce, but their horse thought it was an oxer, a very wide fan jump. That horse luckily was scopy enough to get through that nicely. But you were not supposed to do them as 1 obstacle. You need to do them as 2. So what did we set at home?
We set, if I remember correctly, I believe we ended up setting a U where it was open on one side, and then we set across this tiny indoor ring that was probably 60 feet across. We set the 2 stride. So it was about 1.5 strides off each wall, and then 2 strides between them as a straight 2 stride. And then at the bottom of that U, we had 2 more jumps. And so it was kind of then open on one side. So you could come into it and just jump kind of, out the bottom or in the bottom and then leave. Or you could jump it straight across the ring. Is very difficult to get into straight two stride, or I think a little bit of an angle, or you could do the bending options kind of from either side. So you could come in, go left, come in, go right, So there were loads and loads of options. So, from fairly easy is just essentially a single jump to that difficult straight across the ring, two stride to the nonsense that was the bending.
The nonsense.
And I also remember doing this not only on the horse that I took to Tommy, the horse that I took to medal finals, but on our 4-year-old Hunter, on the amazing large pony that we had, who was probably better at equitation than Tommy at the time.
That little pony, Andy, was so wonderful. That was one of my favorite horses that we had. He was a large pony that I don't even know why. I think, did we get him to maybe resell? Who knows why we had him, but that for any, I'm a real advocate for kids learning on ponies for a certain period of time, but after a certain period of time, it's time to go to horses. If we had that pony when you were little, I would, and when you weren't 18, thinking about the medal finals, I would have tried to keep you on that pony forever. I mean, he was so awesome.
I would have taken him to medal finals, frankly.
Exactly. Yes.
So and then again, so it's doing those different exercises and then doing them on different horses, some of those horses who were very with it and knew what they were doing, and some who had barely 2 brain cells to rub together. And so you had to, help a lot, and you had to direct them very, very explicitly about what you were doing next, because they certainly did not know. That was quite memorable. I also remember us hanging ghosts up around the ring to try to desensitize some of the horses to just, around, things happening.
So that's something that's good for anybody that has a spooky horse. You're right. We did that. We had so many, because I think Tommy did not like white obstacles, right? So we would get, Halloween, decorations and white sheets and drape them over things. I think that desensitization of getting your horse used to so many ugly things can really help in the ring when they're spooking at things like roll tops and things like, what's outside the ring and, kind of anything.
Yeah. It looked like a Halloween store in there for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, this is great. I mean, I think, are there any other lessons that stand out that you can think of that we need to either give our listeners an example of, or say it once more and then say we'll never do that one again?
I've one, the last thing on my list is a little more of a different vibe. It's not a particular lesson format, but I think it's worth mentioning here. So this is actually one of my more memorable lessons from being an older junior. I think this was my last year. We were in Florida, and I had more catch rides than I probably could reasonably fit into a day, which is not a complaint at all, but it was just a very hectic time on one horse, off one horse onto the next for weeks on end. And at the time I was riding a jumper, I believe, for Ann Krasinski. So it was the first time I got to meet her. Amazing woman. And I remember
she is awesome. Yeah, she's such a good horse person.
You're awesome. And this lesson is great. And I think she had maybe an equitation horse or something she thought might be an equitation horse come into her barn. She said, "Hey, can you just come over? I just kind of want to see how it goes with a junior on it, equitation rider on it."
Yeah.
And so I went over, and it was end of the day, someday, and I went over to her barn. I think she was over on Appaloosa Trail or something, close to the grounds. It's still very much in it. And I remember just walking into the barn. I was probably running late and just high energy, very frenetic energy, stress. Yeah. And I remember walking to the barn, and the barn's calm. They're kind of done for the day. The horse is waiting on the cross ties for me to get. She walks in, and she just takes one look at me and is like, "Whoa!" Stand still, get a drink of water, just he's not going anywhere. Just immediately, just that change of energy of just take it down 3 notches. And so I did, and rode the horse, and honestly, I don't remember much about the lesson other than that, I was trying to listen very hard because how many lessons with Ann Krasinski do you get, right?
You get right.
But just that energy
And
change.
looking back now, you probably wish you would have, recorded all of those if you
I
could have.
know, right? But just that, like, and of like, nothing's on fire. Take a deep breath. As from where I was at that moment was like so needed of just sort of the self-imposed, we've all, anybody who's been to Florida, it's week 9 and you're just sort of on this little hamster wheel, and just the invitation to just like get off the hamster wheel for a second and just like was honestly, it's one of my most sticky memories of, I think, that whole last circuit of just like that moment of calm over at her place was so needed. So sometimes if you're seeing somebody like spinning on a hamster wheel, just like an invitation to get off,
yes,
is very, very helpful. I think especially with kids too, who are still learning, maybe don't necessarily know how to do that themselves.
That is possibly the best lesson you could have brought up, because I think that applies so much to everybody's riding, whether you're trying to get ready for a Grand Prix, whether you're taking your horse out, getting ready for a lesson, whether you are just trying to enjoy your ride. And life can be so busy. It doesn't matter if you're coming off of riding a bunch of horses or coming off of a really hard work day that has nothing to do with horses, or just feeling this stressful energy yourself. Your horses feel that. And I got some great advice, very similarly given by Scott Evans, one of my favorite horsemen. And it was just last year. It also happened to be during the winter circuit, and I had dinner with him. And I think I had just come off of a derby off of a young horse that did really well. And he told me, and I'm sorry, it was just prior to a derby where that horse did well, but the horse only did well. I remember this because in that dinner, again, prior to the derby, I was talking about how I'm just running from ring to ring and I need to figure out how to actually enjoy the riding again. And he said, you need to get on your horse and take a breath. And for the first 5 minutes of every ride, which feels like a really long time when you're trying to get, just get on and keep going. He's like, that horse doesn't know what you've been doing. You need to just take your time and take a breath, pet your horse, and connect with why you're even sitting on that horse just for a moment. And that might feel unnecessary at the time, but if you don't stop and breathe, your horse, you're going to get on and your horse is just immediately going to be stressed as well, just as stressed as you. So whatever level of energy you bring to your ride, that's what's going to translate the second you get on. So doing that, whether you're just like Anne told you, like take a drink of water, he's not going anywhere. There should be no reason to rush through any ride. And I remember thinking that when I got on for the Derby the next, week or weekend, or preparing for that Derby, and that horse did so well. And it did that because I think it did that well because I was in a better mindset as I approached the ride, which is a whole nother podcast. We should get into that at some point, but This is a great way to touch on that. And that is such a lesson too. It's not always about what kind of specific riding, you're trying to achieve. It really can be about what is the energy that you bring to your riding, and how can that give you some space to find ease. Like you said, like that lesson in Lake Placid in the tiny ring, that was stressful at the time, but finding that moment in there, or even beforehand, ideally, is such a good way to approach what you're doing. You can get so much more out of it.
Yeah, and I think I like that you drew it back to not only the energy, sort of the mindset you have for yourself, but then how much that's going to affect this horse, especially like in that case that I brought up. It's like I'd never ridden that horse before. It didn't know me. And so, to get on that and for you to immediately sort of exude this, like, I don't know what we're panicking about, but it must be important. Like,
it must be. We must have to be stressed about it. Let's go faster. Yeah. Let's get tighter. Then you're never going to get a supple mouth. Then you're never going to get an easy body. Then you're never going to land the lead, one way or the other. And back to landing that lead. Let's talk about that maybe next time. But when you're landing leads, it's just like how your energy goes into your horse's ride. If you force it, it's not going to go well. If you ease into it and kind of get them off one side and go to the other, then your horse will do what you want. And that's the same way of how you get on. If you ease into it, you're going to be a lot better off than if you force anything. So I'm glad that you remember that lesson from Anne, because I'm sure you had so many other detailed riding lessons from her too. But if that one stands out, I think she would be proud to say that that's important to her as well.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was such a breath of fresh air in the middle of, Wellington circuit as a, teenager. There's a lot going on at that time.
Sure are. Yeah.
Any juniors who have been, either down in Florida or any long, multi-week horse show anywhere where there's a lot of moving parts. So it's good to slow down every once in a while and take that deep breath, take the drink of water.
That's right. Take the drink of water. Exactly. Before you get on every time. Cool. Well, hey, how about our next pod? I had some rider questions, but these were such fun lessons that we talked about. How about next time we do a big listener question and answer that you and I can both give our answers to for our next pod?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool. All right. Sounds great. Okay. So for everyone listening, we'd love to get some more questions from you. So if you have any specifics on any riding techniques or riding lessons or even mental mindset questions, we'd love to hear those. So please feel free to submit them. That's on our Facebook group, Overheard, on the Show Jumping Podcast. You can put your questions there. And thanks for listening today. Thanks, Kimmy. We'll catch you next time.
Yeah. Thank you.